Welcome to the Wondrous Atlas of Creation's Destiny podcast. This is your comprehensive guide to all places and plots Exalted. I am your host, Aramithius.
And this is your co-host, Raelz.
This is the first episode of this podcast, so we are going to be kicking everything off. This is a podcast where we are basically going through the various settings and concepts in Exalted, the role-playing game, so that we can kind of chew through both what they are as a thing, as a source of lore, and then move on to talking about how to weave plots out of all of this stuff. There's some fantastic things in the setting, but one of the things that I know I'm personally quite excited about is kind of thinking about how to get all of that stuff into stories and make those so they're usable in games. But just before we kind of kick off with that, because this is the first episode, you're new to it, we're new to it, and all that sort of stuff, just kind of introduce who we are. So, Raelz, did you want to kick us off with who you are, what your background is, anything and everything about you? Well, within reason.
Yeah. Relative to Exalted, I'm actually quite new to it. I sort of came into Exalted with 3rd edition around sort of September, October 2020, mostly via 1D4chan and the general, the delicate way to say shitposting about the game.
Yeah, it's a very colourful form of shitposting on 1D4chan, and the kind of the background you get from that is kind of, is this really serious? And then you get into the real stuff, and oh, it actually is like that. Was the impression I got.
Yeah, I read about this and I'm just like, okay, this sounds absolutely insane and I love it. And then I read the actual official stuff and it was somehow more insane. I've now got an expansive library of 1st, 2nd and 3rd edition stuff, most of which I haven't read, because I'm deeply financially responsible. I've only ever really storytelled or DM'd, and I've not really ever played long-term as a player. And I've currently got an 8-month or so game in the Scavenger Lands ongoing, and am desperately trying, failing, and trying again to get a game started up with some other people set in the north.
Ooh, what type of stuff are you looking at in the north?
Oh, basically around Grieve and the fun vampire shenanigans therein entailed. And yeah, having a nice simple game, because it will be the people there's first game of Exalted, so it'll be a relatively simple story in a simple place with some Lunas being troublesome.
Okay, so you're equating Lunas with vampires there. Is it just things that go bump in the night?
They're not the same, but the Lunas will be the main... Yeah, pretty much. Grieve is your base city, and it is not safe, but Lunas are our main villain.
Cool. As for me, I got introduced to Exalted around 2002, 3-ish, I think, in 2nd edition. I just kind of thought, that sounds like an absolutely crazy idea. I introduced a whole bunch of stuff around Autochthonia, particularly, with my friend who was just ranting at length about the series. And when I heard that 3rd edition was happening, I grabbed pretty much every book going, having kind of grazed on 2nd edition books in between times, and then just immediately jumped into running a 3rd edition game with my main gaming group. And the current game is still that first game. We are running around various places in the west, most particularly Lathe and the Cinder Isles, trying to overthrow the current government in the Cinder Isles, kick the satrap out, and that sort of thing. That's on hiatus for a bit at the moment. I'm currently storytelling a Victorian Vampire the Masquerade game set in Hong Kong at the moment. And one thing that I didn't pick up in the notes, which was absolutely terrible of me, was podcast history. I've been doing for about the past... since late 2018, I think, an Elder Scrolls lore podcast called Written in Uncertainty, which, as of the time this comes out, I think will be slightly wrapping up. I don't know quite how the schedules are going to work, but if you want to see some of the other stuff I've been doing and what I've been producing, then that's where you can find it. But anyway, we should probably actually get on with this podcast. Okay, so just kind of set the scene a bit to kind of expand out a little. So what is Exalted? This is possibly something that you stumbled on without a whole heap of knowledge about what Exalted is, and I think even for those who are veterans to the game, it's probably useful to set out what our understanding of the game is, because there are however many different takes on this thing, and so if we can understand where we're coming from, it'll probably help you understand what we're thinking and why we're thinking the way we are when it comes to plot hooks and the like. So, Raelz, what is your elevator pitch for the game? If someone was to say, describe Exalted in 30 seconds or less, do it. No pressure or anything.
Yeah, no pressure. Yeah, I would probably err with something of Exalted is one of the highest power level role-playing games that you can get into, leaning very heavily towards your kung fu movie, anime bullshit levels of action sequences, but also a lot in the way it generally plots. It leans towards much, much larger than life characters, settings, actions, everything. It's one of the few role-playing games that really encourages you to be flagrantly bold to the point of stupidity in a fantasy setting that is more, not entirely East Asian inspired, but predominantly, as opposed to the very, very Eurocentric standard setting. And everyone who's anyone worth paying attention to are playing the literal chosen ones of any number of gods and other godlike entities.
Ooh.
A bit over 30 seconds, but it's... I am not one for brevity.
Excellent. That's just what we need in a podcast. But I'm going to take issue with that last point, but that's probably a conversation for another day. My elevator pitch is kind of similar-ish, so it would be just... Exalted is what you get if you smash classical mythology and anime into one place and dust it lightly with Chinese cosmology. As far as I understand it, it's kind of an outgrowth of a bit more in the way of kind of the swords and sorcery subgenre of fantasy, if I can put it that way. It's at the same time high fantasy and low fantasy all at once. It's got a whole bunch of magic, but you don't necessarily have to chase plots that are all world-ending shenanigans. You can go very much into the motivations of all of your characters and your own personal side of things as well. And just as an aside, I'm sure I remember hearing somewhere or reading somewhere that the original pitch for the game was, what happens if we make high fantasy but don't make it Tolkien-inspired, basically. So it was a very, very conscious effort to make something that's non-Tolkien as a setting.
I've not heard that one. The one origin story of Exalted that I have heard is arguably more insane as a prequel to the World of Darkness. As the brief little tangent, around first edition, and they only ever marketed it as this in the first half of first edition and then completely abandoned it, but it's hilarious and so merits being dug out of its grave, that they tried to vaguely imply that creation would eventually, over hundreds of thousands of years and cosmic shenanigans, become the Earth seen in your World of Darkness games, in your Vampire the Masquerade and other such things, which, as you continue listening through this and learn about creation, becomes more and more deranged the more you think about it.
Yeah, I've heard the same story, and I kind of went through an exercise trying to map what each Exalt type was to each supernatural type. I mean, Lunas as weird creatures is a shoo-in. Abyssals as vampires, maybe?
Yeah. Solars as mages is the most compelling one I've heard for them. Or maybe Sids as mages, but there's a fight to be had there. Given how mages are in World of Darkness, they're closer to Solars than to Sids.
Yes, and just for those of you that, if you're new to Exalted, the terms that we're batting around will all be unpacked, but briefly, they are types of Exalted. Different types of these beings that have been chosen by the gods to go forth and do big things, which is kind of how I think of the game as a whole. The one thing that is most noticeable as a difference from D&D, because that's what everyone's going to be comparing it to, is the power level of Exalted. That when you get to your level 20 characters, you might at some point be able to be a ruler of a city or a kingdom or something like that. When it comes to Exalted, that's character generation level, in effect, or can be.
Yeah, and equally, I was going to say, for those familiar with D&D, Exalt type mechanically roughly analogous to races, whereas castes and aspect are roughly analogous to classes.
Yeah, that's actually something I really like about the setting, that you've not got your stock, this is your elves, this is dwarves, this is gnomes, and this is how they're different from every other type of dwarf, elf, gnome, kobold, whatever, that's already out there. Exalted as a setting kind of has humans, exalts, gods, spirits, ghosts, and...
There are other fantasy races, it's just they're nothing to write home about, because exaltation, the ability to basically be a player character, is something that only humans get. I've never seen a Dragon King exalt.
No, absolutely. I've not heard of anything about that setting-wise. But yeah, that does explain why everything else sort of fades away into the background if humans are the only ones able to access kind of god powers, which is basically what exaltation is. I mean, I'm sure we'll get to that in a future episode as to quite what the various types of exalt are and all that sort of stuff. But if humans are the only ones to have managed to exalt, that makes total sense. So that's the setting in very, very broad strokes. I mean, each type of exalted will have its own particular type of game. If you want to just have a quick summary, solars are your bread and butter exalted. If you've got any exalted core, solars are in there.
They are also the most powerful exalt.
Yes, absolutely. Which is a refreshing change, frankly. I remember hearing somewhere that they decided partway through the development of First Edition that they were going to move from Dragon-Blooded as the focus to Solars as the focus so that they didn't get accused of power creep as the different Exalt types came out. Which is a really interesting design choice. It's had such a fantastic impact on the setting. Yeah. I don't imagine it being quite so wuxia in terms of feel if the solars weren't the focus of the setting.
And yeah, the solars' gimmick, as the name implies, they are empowered by the god of the sun, the unconquered sun, and power set-wise, their general gimmick is they're like you or me, but better. Full stop.
They are the best at whatever they do.
They can just do more.
Yeah, they're the best at whatever they turn their hand to. And everything that implies, because the sun is the king of the gods, and yeah, everything that flows from that. Then you've got the Lunar Exalted, which is chosen of the moon, surprisingly enough, who are your shapeshifters, and general insurgents is kind of the other way I process the Lunars.
That's more of a fluff thing than a mechanical thing, though.
True.
The Silver Pact is the only reason they have that rep.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And the Silver Pact is kind of the big organisation of Lunars across creation that is basically trying to fight anyone who's trying to dominate the whole place, which is mostly an organisation called the Realm. And yeah, so yeah, Lunars are the kind of shapeshifters. I take them as trickster archetypes more than anything else, I suppose, as well as that.
Yeah, they are your were creatures. They can do shapeshifting, turning into animals. Like all of the exalts, there's an entire breadth of playstyles within them, so you're not always going to be a sneaky little trickster. It is completely possible, and in many ways encouraged, to play a big stupid Hulk that turns into a bear and bites people's heads off.
Yes, which can be very, very fun to muck around with. Then you've got the Dragon-Blooded, who are the kind of default rulers of the setting, insofar as the setting has rulers, which isn't everywhere, but they're kind of the generally socially accepted exalted in most places. Most of the other types will get stamped out, but Dragon-Blooded won't.
They're the most numerous of the exalts by a country mile. There's about... Numbers of exalts is a really contentious thing that is rather silly whenever they try and make it concrete, but there's always about twice as many dragons as the next common type of exalt. They are also, hilariously, the weakest type of exalt.
Yes. We'll get into reasons as to why, as and when we talk about the general history of the setting, but there's some very definite power tiers that go on within the game, and the Dragon-Blooded are your weakest. As the name kind of implies, they are the chosen of the elemental dragons.
They are also, and this is something that will be gone into deeper later, they're basically second-degree exalts of a... Let's call her a goddess, because getting into what she is in proper depth requires an entire episode, Gaia.
Yes, absolutely. We need to unpack Gaia a bit more, but in a sentence, Gaia has souls that are the elemental dragons. The elemental dragons exalt the Dragon-Blooded, in the same way that Sol exalts the Solars and Luna exalts the Lunar Exalted.
Well, the Dragon-Bloods are, unlike the other two are chosen. Dragon-Bloods, a dragon is born. They are hereditary, and that does lead to the nobility of most places that have Dragon-Bloods.
Yes, and that's also another reason why there are so many of the darn things, because there's not only so many exaltations to go around, they just keep on producing more. The chosen of fate are the Sidereals. They are chosen by the five maidens, and they are, depending on which way you want to run the setting, or want to run your particular game, either heavenly bureaucrats, matrix agents of reality, or kung fu artists who punch things and then they bamf out of existence, or words to that effect. They can punch reality and reshape reality using kung fu.
Yeah, they are one of the few Exalt types that actually gets to... It's weird, we've said earlier that this is a very high power level game. Sidereals are one of the few Exalt types that get to actually interface with the highest powers regularly. They work with heaven, no matter which way you run them. For them, meeting all of the gods of the world isn't some big grand quest thing, it's the daily commute.
Yes, because following on with the Chinese cosmology in Exalted, heaven is a bureaucracy more than it is anything else. The idea that heaven is a governmental system is something that has been cadged pretty much wholesale from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, I think. Is probably the biggest point where that's been grabbed from, if not the...
And older Chinese mythologies.
Yeah, so that's the Sidereals. I think that's probably enough for a basic understanding of the Exalt types.
Yeah. There are others.
Oh, there are definitely others, and we will get to those others. They are very fun.
But all the others tend to be derivatives of the ones we've already mentioned, mostly.
Yeah. So, having had all of that elevator pitch about Exalted itself, the first thing we were going to talk over is why on earth play Exalted? Particularly in regards to D&D, this is a smaller setting trying to aim for big, grand things. And so, what's the appeal of the system itself? For me, it brings you to more world-shaking ideas that and plots that much more easily. And it's also a setting that is very much more alien in how it comes across, because by the time you get to D&D, you'll probably know what an orc is or a goblin is or anything like that. But Exalted will throw you into a world all of its own with its own conventions. And you've got no end of fantasy worlds that have basically the same sort of setup. But Exalted is something very, very different. It kind of makes you take a step back and think, hang on, what's actually going on here, and have to take stuff in. As a new player, that can be quite daunting. If you've not got something familiar to latch onto, then it could be a little difficult, I guess. But it's also you kind of stare wide-eyed at it, or at least I did, and just kind of go, wow, so much stuff, not seen this before.
Yeah, I was going to say, unsurprisingly for two people doing a podcast on the setting of this, the setting is the big draw. It is utterly, utterly unique. There isn't anything else like it. If you are comparing directly to D&D 5th, my dread nemesis, I will rip the band-aid off immediately. It will cause some upset for those of you that like how mechanical D&D 5th is. Because the rules... There's probably other times to get into it, but the rulebook for Exalted is a hefty tome. You could use it to lay down the foundations for your house. But most of the rules in it are a lot lighter touch than something like D&D. If you've played other White Wolf or Onyx Path games, your World of Darknesses, your Scion, your Trinity, those things, you're familiar with the storyteller system, and you know all of the criticisms that would come with it, and how I'm being very, very delicate about describing it to try and make it sound like a positive. But it works. It is still amazing as a setting, and as wonky as it mechanically is as an engine, it is very, very good at making you feel very, very impactful.
Yeah.
Not necessarily always powerful, because you can play a Dragonblood, or if you want to be laughed out the room, a Mortal, but you still feel like you're accomplishing things. I mean, it's the standard thing of stat scaling. For most Exalts, on a 1 to 5 rating on stats, 2 is the most a normal human will ever be able to get to.
Yes, which it does interesting things mechanically, but I'm not quite qualified enough to get into the crunch with stats. But there is part of me that's thinking back to World of Darkness, if we can diverge for a second. I'm not sure whether the 2 as a normal mortal is, or as the peak of mortal achievement, is quite there.
That may not be canon as of 3rd. It definitely was in 2nd.
Oh, okay.
This is the big issue betwixt the two of us here. My understanding of the lore is based on some unholy abomination fused of all 3 editions. And so I may get things out of chronology, but this is rarely a problem because 3rd edition as current doesn't have much material for it.
Yeah, that's probably another caveat for the podcast as a whole, actually. We'll be drawing material from all 3 editions for inspiration and what you can expect from certain things. We'll try and mention where things come from and where you can kind of plug it into the rest of the setting as we go, but that may not always happen, just so you're aware. My understanding, this may be just a bad import, just to get back onto the dot scaling. My understanding, which is probably imported wholesale from World of Darkness, is that 2 is average, 3 is above average, 4 is professional, and 5 is the limits of human capability.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like normal mortal capability versus Exalt capability. Humans cap out different, is as I'd understood it. This may just be second. I may be completely wrong with third, but what I understood it was that in second, a 5-dot mortal is on a solar sheet 2 dots. Because they can go that far beyond. But either way, there will, on the matter of where things are from as well, at some point in the distant nebulous future, there will be a textual aspect released along with the podcasts, and I at least do compile reading lists for where I've got my things from, so we will have at least half a bibliography.
Yep, that is a very good habit to get into, and one that I've developed from various other places. So yes, you will definitely be getting bibliographies as to where we can plug things into from as and when we get there. Before we kick into the meat of the podcast, then, we should probably just explain what the format of the podcast itself is going to be. We're going to spend the first half of each episode talking about, the first section of each episode talking about the setting of a particular place or concept within the Exalted universe. We will have a section that is looking at what we see as setting out what a particular place is, how we understand it, and that sort of thing. Then we will drop a curtain down and say, right, GMs and storytellers only beyond this point, because then we will start discussing story hooks based on the place or the thing that we've just been discussing. So if you are just a player who just wants to hear what the world of Exalted is, listen to the first half, and then if you are a storyteller, listen to the whole thing, and then we'll talk through ideas and how to develop those into plots, and potentially, depending on how crunchy we want to get, into things you can just plug straight into your games, as well as linking those to the aforementioned text stuff that we're going to be producing as well. So there may well be more solid systemic stuff when we come to write up all of the ideas that we're talking about. This episode we are going to be discussing the Solar Exalted, which, as you may have picked up from the talk through, is kind of the default thing for many Exalted, or the default player character type. It's the thing that has come in all the core books since the start, and has also been the kind of the focus of the setting. If there are kind of protagonists from a perspective for a lot of the time, it's going to be Solars. So that's what we're discussing today. But if we can just kind of kick off with just a brief few sentences on what Solars are. Raelz, did you want to hit that ball rolling? I'm aware I've been talking a fair bit.
Yeah, the Solars are archetypically the greatest, the mightiest, and the bestest ever of all of the Exalted, because they're chosen by the unconquered sun, the king of the gods, your Zeus without the sex, Jupiter with... yeah, pretty much just Jupiter.
Although clouds are not his thing, it must be said.
No clouds, but a lot of the... he's the sky god, but also very much the war god.
That's a fair assessment. Yeah, I would kind of go along with, they are the chosen of the sun, they are all-conquering and moments, and their key thing is moments of brilliance, I think, is how they're sort of designed to function. They're just designed to be flashes of something that's more than human, and everything that means.
Yeah. One of the ways I've had with sort of explaining them that also ties into the sort of way that I tend to see the unconquered sun himself. A lot of the other Exalt types that we will get into later have a very clear and unique sort of theme. Like Lunars, they're all about animals and wildlife and shape-shifting. Infernals are all about hell and demons and sex and drugs and rock and roll. Solars, and by extent the unconquered sun, are just human. And this goes thematically both in universe of, they are just humans that are better at human things. It's one of the standard lines of anything a Solar sets their mind to, they will eventually become the best person on creation at it. And even then, mechanically, Their thing with the way that they have a nasty tendency of going absolutely insane, spoiler alert, is again, they are the most human despite being the most powerful.
Yes, that's true. That's kind of one of the things that I think clears something up from my perspective, because the whole idea of, they're the best at everything and whatever they turn their mind to. And when you kind of pair that with the most human, that gives you a perspective on that that's a little different. And I think it's also potentially an echo of some things from D&D and general fantasy tropes now I think about it. Because whenever humans are being set against another fantasy race, they're generally said of, they're the most adaptable, to give them a reason as to why they don't have specific racial bonuses. And so if Solars they can do whatever they want, just provided whatever they want isn't anything particularly outside of the ballpark of human competence, then it's that on crack.
Yeah, they are very much sort of, I mean, it goes right down to the mechanic of the thing that they have, and yes, the edition gives it to everyone, but they have excellencies. It's just the thing that they are, the skill or ability, whatever, that they are good at. That this is what I practice, this is what I like, this is what I'm great at. They are, again, to steal flagrantly from the books, they are your Hercules. They are most of your Greek mythological heroes, frankly.
Yeah, and that sort of ties into kind of characters from swords and sorcery in general, like Conan would absolutely be a Solar. Whether or not he would be a Nightcast or not depends on quite what book you're reading, because I read a fair bit of that, and that's how I would place Conan. But one of the things I wanted to sort of check, because I think Conan suffers from this narratively as well, is the idea of, they're the best at everything they sort of turn their mind to, and that can be a little interesting to try and get your head around as to what the Solars are and how that works with conceptualizing them, if I can put it that way. I think an issue if you're dealing with mixed splat games than anything else, games with different types of Exalted. If you have Solars, they can potentially steal the thunder of anyone in any given moment.
Yeah, the way I've always seen it with them, their sort of thing, I lean really heavily, even though Exalted as a whole, as we've sort of gone into, is broadly a lot more Eastern than it is Western. Solars are damnably Greek, with everything they are. Their thing is always, and this reflects mechanically as well as thematically, it's skill. What they make up for in massive amounts of skill, they lack really in, I guess you'd call it supernatural versatility. Like, sure, you make one a sorcerer, he's going to be a damn good sorcerer. Solar sorcery is a thing that only they can do that is absolutely hilarious. But your average run-of-the-mill Solar on the ground, you pair him with a Luna, there are going to be things that Luna can do that Solar is not going to have a chance in hell with. Well, Luna shape-shifting for one, but then also the setting itself. Solars are great, Solars are amazing, Solars are powerful. They're also pretty much the most hated thing since sliced bread.
Yeah, absolutely. They don't really have their own place and their own refuge or their own society. I mean, Lunas are a fair contrast there, but I don't want to get too much into the weeds of that. But I think we talked enough about Solar thematics for a while. I'm sure we'll go back to it. This tends to be the way we work. But shall we talk through their casts, what they are, just so people have an awareness of the different types of Solars that are out there and what they do and what their influences are.
And for those outside of the... for those who don't already know Exalt too well, if your Exalt type is your race, your caste is your class. And we got 5 of them.
Yes. We have Dawns, who are, in brief, the warriors and generals. There are the Zeniths, who are the priests or leaders. Twilights, who are the sorcerers or engineers, basically nerds. The Knights, who are the assassins or shadowy protectors. If you want Batman, he will probably be a knight. And the Eclipse Caste, who are the diplomats and explorers.
And have one of the most comedically broken things pretty much in the game that they can do as default.
Yes, I'm sure we'll get to oaths in a bit. but if we wanted to talk through each of those and just what their thematics are, and potentially with some bits of the system mixed in as well.
Again, I'm still not great with what most of them, except for the Eclipses, which is the one that my active game has a member of in. I'm not great mechanically on what the rest of them all exactly do. So starting at the top, starting with Dawns, they are probably the easiest for anyone new to role-playing as a whole to sort of conceptualise, because, yeah, a Dawn is, not to put too fine a tip on it, a big guy with a big stick, what he hits you with.
Yes, although that doesn't necessarily need to mean low intelligence. We are not dealing with exalted barbarians
No.
at this point.
They absolutely could be it, but yeah.
Yes.
Again, I see all of this in Greek. Adorn is Hercules. That is the quickest and easiest way you put it for.
Yep, that's fair enough, and you can kind of have a bunch of archetypes within that. You can have different warrior types, you can have your Hercules, if you have a martial artist, if you want them to be a fantastic martial artist at character gen, they're going to be Adorn. That's one of the defining things about that cast. The way that Exalted differentiates Solars is that they have one ability that they are fantastically good at, which is their supernal ability, and Dawns are the only cast that can choose a martial ability as their supernal. Whether it's brawl, whether it's melee, or whether it's martial arts, or whether it's archery, only Dawns can pick those as their supernals, so only they can get to the endgame charms from character gen and everything that sort of thing means. Next up we have the Zeniths, who are basically the faces. They get cast as priests or leaders, but it's basically anyone who is good at... Well, I say anyone who's good at talking, but that kind of does the eclipses down a bit. The Zenith's deal is leading masses, which is... I don't know, they get kind of put in as kind of demagogues or that sort of thing. One of the interesting things thematically for me about Zeniths, I think, that differentiates them from everything else, is that they are the priests of the unconquered sun. In a world where worship of the unconquered sun is generally not that common, because of how the realm has suppressed pretty much everything apart from worship of the elemental dragons, and everyone else almost seems to have forgotten about it.
As I understood it, people know that he exists, it's just that the way that the Immaculate Order has taught it is... Well, he doesn't do anything, which I forget if we mentioned before, that the Unconquered Sun is the absent father of a couple of thousand superheroes.
Yes.
He doesn't do anything, so you don't need to worship him. He's a powerful force, but if you do worship him, if you don't worship him, he doesn't react either way, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I suppose that's a different thing with Exalted, where you have an active setting where gods can beat your doors down and demand prayer. The Unconquered Sun doesn't do that and doesn't need to do that.
He sits in his house playing Yu-Gi-Oh! All day. And that's only slightly an exaggeration.
Yeah, it's kind of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where there's magic money involved.
Yeah, but on that matter of him being absent and far away and never interacting with anyone, the Zeniths are the exception. At the moment of their exaltation, when they explode and become a superhero and cause massive, massive damage to everything in the vicinity, every other Solar, that just happens to, and they go a bit crazy with Essence Fever, because, well, if you suddenly got superpowers, you'd start trying them out as well. But the Zeniths, when they do it, the Unconquered Sun will speak to them. Briefly, it's usually only a few sentences.
Yeah,
he tells them something.
I wasn't quite sure whether or not to kind of treat it as a personal mandate, or whether we're just dealing with a divine answer machine here.
As I read it, there's a fun little bit of reader recommendation. First edition had a series of 5 cast books for Solars, and 3 for Lunars and 5 for Dragonbloods, but that's separate, that give you a lot more detail about the themings and the stylings and all the bits and pieces of the different Solar casts. The way they sort of phrase how the Zeniths get spoken to, it seems to be, at least from the phrasing, the one bit of hinting we've got that he might be coming back and that he might be aware that the Solars are returning, because they're all tailor-made, they're all different for each person. Mm-hmm. They've got common themes, so it's always, he tells them that they are being chosen by him, that they're super-duper great and all of that. He will tell them some variation on the phrase, go out and make the world right as best you know, which is the official way that you can have any sort of morality within your Zenith, because he doesn't give you a direct order, but he makes them aware that he knows what they're going through. Like, again, in the book, one of the ones that was given was a woman that got taken on a pirate ship by the man with no shadow, who was super duper empowered by a Death Lord, but he wasn't an Abyssal, he just got superpowers from them for a different reason. And she led a mutiny against him and took the pirate ship and was being a good pirate instead of a bad pirate. And he references that when he speaks to her about it. He doesn't give them an order, but he tells them that he's chosen them, and more importantly, unlike some of the other ones, he tells them why he chose them.
Yeah, that's okay. We can explore that a bit more when we get to talking about the nature of the solar exaltation itself. But that kind of clears up quite a few of my questions. So I was also thinking, is this something that's unique to the spark rather than the person? So is he broadcasting the same message to the same zenith spark all the time, that he's chosen that spark to be a particular type of zenith? But if it's tailor-made to the context, then he's absolutely paying attention, which is interesting in and of itself as for what that means for how much attention he's paying. As you say, it kind of hints that he has got to be aware that there's more solars around, because if he's doing more zenith exaltations, then he's going to be pulled away from the games a bit more often.
Yeah, and he says it to at least 2 of them in that book, that he gives it of, I had turned my face away from creation, and now look what has become of it, no more, and then blah 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 blah.
Yeah, it does a similar thing. One of the bits of fiction in the 3rd edition core, the bit where the Zenith to be smashes the Unconquered Sun's statue, and he basically turns up and says, well, I don't really blame you, but that's going to change. So
yeah, it's interesting because Zeniths, you mentioned that like being good at talking and that sort of steps on the toes of the Eclipse, and I'll admit again, this is just sort of the way that I've sort of seen it, is Eclipses are good at socialising with other people, but Zeniths, they're good at leading masses, but a lot of the way that they seem to be keyed, at least, it's not all the time, but it happens frequently enough at least that I can say it's a partial rule, they are better at working with other solars. Like, if you've got a perfect circle, as they call it, when you've got one of all 5, the Zenith's going to be the one that actually keeps the whole band together and herds those cats.
Yeah, absolutely, because they're tailor-made to be leaders in the way that Eclipses aren't. And one other thing that was curious, at least in 3rd edition, was that they are one of the ones that have survival as one of their potential cast abilities. I mean, apart from meaning that you can build a Zenith as Moses in the wilderness, I'm not really sure what else to make of that one.
The cast book made a really big deal about survival and endurance, even compared to Dawn's with these guys. It also seems to come that, again, we'll get to it when we get to the solar exaltation. All exaltation is at least slightly traumatic, but these guys seem to have it especially rough. That bit of fiction in the 3rd edition was odd in that she was just mostly alone smashing a statue, although if memory serves, her village was getting razed by something or other at the time. But the ones in the cast book, like, you have the one who was leading the mutiny, and she only exalted when she tried to pick the fight with him, and it failed, and she was about to die. There was another guy his caravan was attacked by brigands and he was left to die in the desert, and he is just Moses. There was one who was a Nexan gladiator who was dying in the ring, the whole thing. They always seem to have a really rough time of it, and they always seem to get... It's also so they can be sort of mendicant priests, basically. They can go wandering around, talk to the villagers and all that, and live off the land, the whole bit. Whereas other solars, Eclipses especially, like, solars are good, solars are great, they're not immortal, they're not invincible. They still need to eat, they still need to drink. Zeniths, not so much, they could kind of just wander off.
That's a really nice piece of thematics, actually, that fits, and I remember now Resistance as well in 3rd edition is one of their potential supernals. I think it is for some others as well, because it's one of those abilities that works out as martial, so Dawns may have it as a possible, but I can't quite remember. Next up we have Twilights, who are the sorcerers and engineers and architects and scholars. It covers everything from Howl from Howl's Moving Castle to... says he, trying to think of something off the fly. Merlin, yep.
Importantly, though, if you want to do a sorcerer, you don't have to be a Twilight. They just kind of have a short... Well, no, they don't even have a shortcut in 3rd, do they? Because you can't fast-track your way to top-level sorcery. I say this exclusively because, again, sort of my main game, our party sorcerer is an Eclipse Caste. And there was a very deliberate path around building that, which we'll get to when we talk about Eclipse. But the Twilights, they are your nerds, they are your... They're one of the, I would argue, easiest to use as a villain as well. Not even with mustache-twirling evil, just because if there's going to be a solar that... One of the other big themes that were of solars that we didn't mention, that I should have when I was talking about the Greeks, hubris.
Yes.
These are the guys whose hubris hurts the most people.
Absolutely, because they generally wind up in leadership positions and that sort of thing.
And they really shouldn't.
No!
they mess around with things that they oughtn't.
Yeah, and Twilights are kind of well positioned to do that. If you've got a Solar that is going to be mucking around with the fundamental levers of reality, it is most likely to be a Twilight.
Yeah. They want to know more, and they don't really know why, they just want to know more. It's knowledge for knowledge's sake, and all of the problems that therein follow.
Yes, and as you say, kind of they are your typical sorcerers. That tends to mean building things in Exalted, because sorcery as a combat thing and casting spells is very situational, and
unless you're homebrewing heavily, battle magic isn't really viable as a combat tactic.
No, because you need to wait about 4 rounds for it to go off. And so the key thing about sorcery, and so one of the key things about Twilight, is being able to build stuff. And so the consequences of those buildings, kind of the wonders of the First Age, which we will get to when we go into a bit more about the history, and that sort of thing are being built by Twilights. If they're trying to rediscover things, you've got your ideas of Twilight archaeologists. Again, this is sort of some of the broader ways of thinking about what Exalted are and how they function. Twilight's one of those that gives you a bit more flexibility than the other casts. They've also got some very weird cast powers. I've realised we haven't talked about cast powers so far, but a lot of them are quite intuitive. Just to give a rough summary, Dawns get a bonus to intimidating people, and there's combat bonuses, and so they're good at fighting and they're good at making you think they're good at fighting. Zeniths can sanctify dead bodies and make sure that they don't rise as hungry ghosts. You can tell I've just latched onto one particular ability per cast here, because that's all I'm picking up. Well,
to be fair, they have lots of boring +1 to this, +2 to that, and then they do all basically have one cool little fluffy ability.
Yeah, but the Twilight's ability that really stood out to me is the one that doesn't really fit. They have the ability to make themselves magically harder to kill, and they also disappear for a certain amount of time and then reappear sometime later, which really doesn't make a whole heap of sense to me.
I was going to say, just checking them now, the Dawn one, as we were doing it, their little fluffy one, they've got the Intimidation one that you mentioned, and then the one where they can reset all of their cooldowns.
Yeah, so it's just use all of your combat stuff again.
Zeniths can consecrate bodies, and also, and this one is one that is probably very interesting and fun, they can force spirits to manifest, which is useful, because when you're fighting ghosts and they just decide to leave...
Yeah, then you've got a way of bringing them back. Another thing for the Zenith, which kind of emphasises the priest stuff again, we're going all over the map here, this is going well, is that they can also take on intimacies from the dead as they consecrate them, and then kind of discharge them when they meet people who knew the dead person. This is a kind of a feeling of passing on a parent's love for their child sort of thing, to give warm and fuzzies to help the mourning process. And you can also take on someone's hatred for someone and then pass that on as a screw you, this person really didn't like you kind of notion. So those are kind of the two examples that get given, and they're kind of neat and thematic for a role of kind of emotional counsellor, which Zeniths can wind up being. But the Twilight's one, the running away, it feels a bit weird to me, simply because it doesn't seem to fit thematically with Twilight. I mean, good at running away isn't really something you think about when you look at scholars.
Yeah, reading it, I'd almost say that probably should have been a Nightcast one. Of just disappear and vanish for a bit. But frankly, the cynic in me says they needed to have 3 for each, and they've made it that in 3rd edition there are no shortcuts to magic. Because, if I recall correctly, in some of the old editions, one of the Twilight's things was they can shortcut magic.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me, because 3rd edition is kind of going for a bit more on the kind of the rawer side of things, and making things a bit more gritty.
It's not even the grittiness, because the older editions, read later day 2nd edition anytime if you want to watch the 90s try to be edgy. The problem with it, it's trying to be balanced, which is something that as a setting this really doesn't lend itself to.
No, that's true, and I think that's possibly why they're trying to give Twilight's a combat ability. This has persisted across editions, I do remember that much. So this is kind of one of the archetypal, this is an Exalted Twilight thing.
Probably then it's just for the cowardly wizard trick. Or again, for if you're using them as a villain.
The kind of throwing a smoke bomb on the floor, mwahahaha, I live to fight another day, sort of thing.
So yeah, moving on to the Night Cast. This is Batman. There's no two ways around that.
Yeah, they are the ones that work in darkness. They are assassins, protectors. Dare I say it, silent guardians.
One might even call them a Dark Knight.
Yes, we're going in for the full thing here, but they should be able to be more than that. Yeah. I mean, you can do much more with them. I've realised this when going through character concepts. I think the Knight possibly has the most overlap with other casts as to what they can do. Knights are much more about how they do a thing rather than what they do. They are covert, they are hidden, they do things without people noticing. Quite what those things are will vary night to night, and so they're kind of flexible.
That's sort of the key thing. Every cast can fill, to varying degrees of competency, but every cast can fill at least adequately pretty much any party role you could think of. It's just how they'll do it will be differently. Like, if you say you wanted to go for a sort of detective sort of thing, your Nightcast detective is going to... Well, you're going to run into film noir or Batman, depending on how much you want to make them hurt people. But you could have a Dawncast one, who is your standard cop show, hit him with a stick and ask him to confess bit. Or your Zenith one, who is trying to be Poirot. Or your Twilight, who is Harry Dresden. Every cast can do everything. Though the Nightcast does seem... Of all the casts, except maybe Dawn, the Nightcast is one of the ones you're most likely to pick for the mechanics more so than for the thematics.
Yeah, and a lot of the Nightcast anima abilities are all stealth-based. They do things about dampening their anima effects, which is really, really nice. I really like that as a Knight's ability. And one of their other cast effects is that when they go supernova, so to speak, when they've burnt through enough essence to make their anima at its highest possible level, at bonfire level, you can't tell their identity, which is a really nice thing if you want to be an overt solar. Then you just burn through all of your peripheral and no one cares. You just kill anyone who saw you while you were getting there.
Yeah, because the biggest problem with solars is, sort of like I said before, you're given the most power, but when people say anathema, they, technically, theologically, anathema is lots of things, but you ask your average peasant, they mean you.
Yes. Which can actually wind up with some fantastic conflict if you've got some characters that were raised within the Immaculate Faith and then suddenly exalted as solars. You've got some soul searching that should be going on. There's the kind of, okay, I'm now the demon that I was told was going to kill everything. What on earth do I do with that? Especially
across the different manifestations of caste here, having it as a Zenith is the most interesting. It's no surprise. Again, Caste Book Zenith has... But 2 of the 5 that it gives you in that book are immaculate in one way or another. One of them was a monk, and one of them was a second daughter of a Luxine family that didn't exalt, which is just unfortunate for her. But it's that thing of, when you as an immaculate become the big evil super monster, most of you don't want to be thrown in the dungeon and locked away and or tortured forever. But the ones that get told specifically and have no way to really hide from the fact of... And this is the one that will attract me, the angry letters being sent in, of the person that is trying to make you a moral actor and is trying to be good, that goes against completely everything you have been told.
Yes, that's a lovely way for storytellers to try and make clear the contrasts between the Immaculate Faith, the realm, and the moral order, so to speak. Having Zeniths around will make that a lot more overtly theological and much more present, particularly as the Unconquered Sun is handing out manifests and mandates to the Zeniths. And the Knights are almost the flip side of that, because they're probably the cast most appealing for you if you want to have someone who is morally grey verging on black, because they're going to be doing things that most societies would consider underhand, not necessarily most people, but things that society tends to consider bad, like theft or property damage and that sort of stuff. That's your stereotypical Knight activities. And they're also far enough removed from the moral centre of the Unconquered Sun that they can quite easily just be someone who just wants to use the power to set themselves up their own empire. I don't know whether we have any concrete examples of that.
They're the one that you can make gittish. I wouldn't necessarily say they're the one with the most room for evil, because Twilights exist and Eclipses exist, And a Twilight villain will be full-on Dr. Faust. They have a lot of mileage for it. Well, Twilights have a lot of mileage for villainy and evil because of what sorcery is. Sorcery tends to involve working with hell in one way or another, and hell, in case you didn't know, is quite bad.
Yeah, even in the Exalted setting, which makes some fantastic things and differences about hell, it's... hell and demons, they work on a completely different moral compass, which is frequently at odds with the rest of creation. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, if good says it's white, then hell says it's black, sort of thing. It's not simple opposition. It's just they're pulling in quite a different direction. Yeah. And we will get to the motivations of hell and Malpheus and all the rest of it in another cast, so hold on for that one.
Yeah. Moving on to the Eclipses then.
Yes.
Which we already set up how hilarious one of their abilities could be. An Eclipse, they are... Again, for the D&D players in the crowd, they're your bard. There's, again, not really too many ways around that. They are your social cast. They aren't mass social, that is more Zenith, but they are individual social. They will walk into the room, cast a wry grin, and schmooze someone off their feet.
Yes, absolutely. And they're also there to build bridges. There's an overt sort of a combination of both exploration and making amends, making not necessarily compromises, but diplomacy is the Eclipse thing in a way that it isn't for the others. So it's a case of getting everyone in a room talking around and then moving on. But in the same breath, Eclipses could quite as well be Dr. Livingstone as much as Henry Kissinger, just to give you archetypes. I say archetypes to work on. Henry Kissinger was more than an archetype, he was a person. They both are, so...
Equally, if you want to sort of narrow it down, is narrowing down both Zeniths and Eclipses to do this, but they are the two you have to compare, because none of the casts step on each other's toes as much as those two.
Yeah.
If a Zenith is ideal for social with other solars and social with people, the Eclipse is your face for when you're dealing with gods and elementals, and more broadly, the supernatural. I mean, the piece of fiction in the third core book for the signature Eclipse straight up just has them cutting a deal with a river god, if memory serves. And that's kind of their day-to-day.
Yes, that matches up quite well with their cast abilities, that the idea of the Eclipse have diplomatic immunity is the way that it's put when they're dealing with the enemies of creation. So long as they have legitimate business with a reason to be talking to a particular spirit or a demon or a fae, anything like that, and you can't attack an Eclipse or anyone in their party.
As long as they reveal themselves as such and invoke it, it is something you have to do call for.
Yeah, which can also end up with some fantastic consequences as well.
That wasn't the broken thing we were talking about, though. Would you like to go on about the oath?
Yes! If a promise is made within the hearing of an Eclipse, they can activate their cast mark and say that it is sanctified, and if that is broken, even if it's right down to, if you don't do your homework, I'm going to kill you, something as frivolous as a parent saying that to a child, an Eclipse can light up and say, I sanctify that, and anyone who doesn't fulfill the terms of the oath is going to be cursed for it.
Yep, they have calmed it down over the editions. I forget what it is in third. In the old one, it was straight up getting smoked.
It's down to storyteller discretion as to what the curse is in third. So it's not quite as bad.
But yeah, it's the most obviously and easily abused power out of the entire cast gamut, and it's one of the reasons that I would sort of say, as a storyteller, you have to be very careful when your players are sort of making up characters as to who's going to do that. Because, again, I'll go with the standard one of this game that I'm running now, which has an Eclipse as our sorcerer. And the reason that they went for Eclipse, not Twilight, they wanted to be primarily a summoner. And so they sort of went with the idea of, no, this isn't... A Twilight would summon demons and elementals to use them as tools to get a thing. An Eclipse summons them as... you wouldn't call them people, but he gets to know them. They are friends with them. But then also, you have a bit tighter control, because summoning already gives you a good degree of control, but he invokes this oath with just about everything he summons to make sure it cannot be turned against him.
That is a really nice way of gaming the system.
Yeah.
And that idea of the difference in the way in how they're doing it, that the Twilight uses day labour, the Eclipse has people on retainer, just as a way of thinking about the difference. And I've not seen the oath abused in the games that I've run, but in several of the public games that I've seen, there hasn't been any of them where that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Particularly when you've got new players. If you are new to Exalted, then your storyteller will likely thank you for not using this right up to the hilt, but feel free to have fun with it. If you're a storyteller, then yeah, be ready for players to want to use this at every possible opportunity.
It's one of the other things as well, just sort of going on the line that we have weirdly in this point gone for, and how you can make them your baddies. An Eclipse villain has an awful lot of mileage to it.
Yes, I think we can talk through that a bit more once we get to the story hooks and so on section, but just bear in mind there are some fantastic ways that you can make the Solars into your bad guys. Solars are not good. Partly because of how the spark works, which we should probably get to talking about, but the key thing about the solar spark, or the celestial sparks in general, so your solars, your lunars, and sidereals, as well as abyssals, is that the spark reincarnates. It goes from person to person.
That's the thing, I wasn't sure if sidereals did. I can't recall if sidereals do properly reincarnate like that, or if they don't have something weirder. It would be very on brand for them to have something weirder.
Yep.
And also infernals as well also do it, but abyssals, infernals, and solars are all the same thing, painted different.
Yeah, one of the terms you'll hear bandied around is solaroids for that, and that's the term that's used to describe all of those three. Anything that's derived from a solar exaltation. The solar exaltations and the sparks go from person to person as they die, and then there's some of the memories of previous incarnations get moved on with the spark, which can serve as fantastic story fodder if you're wanting some additional bits of character background. It can also serve that quite well, particularly if you're building a character and you don't know the setting, but you want to develop stuff over time. Then having a spark that's gradually affecting the character as they play, and so there's like, oh, I remember that I was doing this, and you're driving them towards certain activities through the nature of the solar spark, either as a storyteller or as a player. That's quite a handy way to build stuff out as you go.
Yeah, as a storyteller, they are excellent tools. It requires a very specific kind of story for them, but Exalted in general does actually lend itself quite well to the standard anime fantasy. This is the prophecy of 4,000 years. The Solars, you can have them remember what they were doing back then occasionally. Even if you go for the right down the stereotype line of you have a dream where you're on a mountain and you see the man with the sword, you have no idea what this means. And then you can pull it in later where, oh, hey, look, this is that mountain with that man with that sword. Except everyone's dead because it was 4,000 years ago.
Yes. The thing that I was kind of thinking about, just kind of going off our discussion on Solars as villains, is that the spark doesn't necessarily... Well, it only kind of knows what it's looking for. I think of it like an algorithm. It's programmed to look for certain characteristics, but doesn't look too carefully beyond those characteristics. It's kind of like, yeah, this is an 80% match for the criteria I have programmed in. You'll do.
Yeah, the line, there was a specific term for it, what they were looking for. It's heroic potential, I believe was the term that is used in the thing, which is, again, hero in the Greek sense. This does not have any moral axis to it. The line that I've sort of liked to use is, Solars are great, that does not make them good.
Yes, absolutely. And the kind of the choices that the spark makes, I use choices in inverted commas there, just purely based on someone's ability to carry out a particular task. One of the things that gets said of Solars specifically, but I don't know about other types of Exalted, off the top of my head anyway, is that it will not choose people who are afraid to use it or unwilling to use it. I have seen some games where people have tried to portray someone who's had the solar exaltation and their response is, this has destroyed my life, can I get rid of it? That strikes me as a characterization that shouldn't really be possible for a solar.
Yeah, I mean, as a storyteller, the way I would see that is if a player gave me that, I would direct them to the nearest Death Lord or cracked Amalpheus, because there's a solution to that.
Yeah, but you kind of assume that characters have a self-preservation instinct either way.
No, not kill them. I mean, it's the fact that Solars can be changed.
That's true.
It's a matter of, this is not a solar-based fact. Even if you assume, like, even if the spark did go into that person by hook or by crook, because it's an imperfect science, and there's the fact that, and we'll get into this more when we do the history, but all of the solar exaltations were kept in a box for 2,500 years. But when they're all coming out, this is the way that you could do a reluctant hero solar. You could either do it with the standard thing we mentioned earlier of they're immaculate, they are willing to use the power, they might not be willing to use this power. That's a way to take it. They have an issue with the source, not the ability.
Yeah, that's a really nice idea. The idea of, oh dear, I have now become an anathema. And then if they get found by something that is willing to change them into an abyssal or an infernal, then they can go to that source and get converted to be the monsters they think they are.
Or equally, you could use it as your arc for the heroism of they get made that offer by the... Inevitably, you have to make it a slimy, shady individual in either case of, yes, take the power. And then they realise, okay, I might be anathema, but that's worse. That's got tentacles.
Yes! And yeah, you can kind of make that idea part of a character's journey, that sort of realisation as to what they are, and so on. One final thing before we kind of wrap up the talk on sparks, I think, is that the effects that it has long-term, so to speak, on a soul. One of the big things that happens with souls is that their ghosts are extremely powerful. The exaltation imbues their soul with some degree of additional abilities. It's not clear on a systems level precisely how much that is. I have seen some comments recently that is saying that if you want to do it on a systems level, you're basically looking at a hungry ghost with bigger dice pools, rather than going for something of say a Nephrax power level.
Yeah. The key thing with the solar ghosts is that not all solar ghosts are Death Lords. All Death Lords are solar ghosts.
Yes. That is fair enough. The most common way that you'll have interactions with solar ghosts is in solar tombs, generally. We'll get more into this in the history in a second, but the solar tombs that are locked away with their old bodies, and generally their artifacts as well, so you have your excuse for a treasure hunting adventure, and the ghosts that are there and left with them are just potentially angry at being locked away, but not a whole heap else, but they are still immensely powerful because the spark leaves a mark on the soul of the Exalt.
They don't necessarily have to be angry about it either. There's mileage for lots of other things, because what it effectively does is it just... I mean, I saw it referred to as the exaltation juice. It just gives them a bit more oomph, a bit more kick. Again, I'm going to keep tying back with Solar Theme into like the whole sample size of one of what the Solar in my game's got going, but, you know... All role-playing is anecdotal. His mentor and his sorcery tutor is a solar ghost. He took the man's merit at character creation, didn't have many dots to spend on it, got the lowest amount he could, so he basically has a ruin that has a ghost in it that quite likes him. Because he's an eclipse, and it's the sort of thing of, he knows he's an eclipse, he was a solar back in his day, so he's not falling for the bull crap, but he's like, yeah, no, you're still decent.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
And it's that sort of thing, it's just, they are... powerful ghosts, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to fight them.
That's true, and that's one of the things about Exalted as a game. It's just finding non-combat solutions is one of the big things in the game, and defeat doesn't necessarily mean death. But that's a whole other general role-playing tangent. In which case, the history of the Solar Exalted, they were created by the gods because the gods wanted to be lazy oiks. Basically.
Well, no. They're created by the gods, because the gods were stuck in a game where someone abused their Twilight Oath power and said, you cannot hit me. And this was the workaround.
Oh dear. Yes, it is that. But let's just break this down to orders of creation, I think, is how we do this. Creation was made by an order of beings called the Primordials, who are multifaceted souled things that exist, both the creators of the material universe and part of it. These are people like Gaia, whose physical existence is the material world, Autochthon, who is basically a primordial twilight.
Not even that, he is technology and creation. Not creation as in the place, lowercase c creation, the making of things. Theon, the great king, and she who lives in her name didn't change her name, so we can stick with that.
Okay, these are kind of big things that they function more on the order of sort of cosmic forces than deities as such, and they realised that being the universe and making sure everything runs properly without falling back into the chaos of the wild is actually really tiring work. Whereas all they really want to do is muck around with the games of Divinity. Created the games of Divinity, like, we've made this really, really cool game, but we don't have any time to play it. And so the Primordials create the gods, who can then run creation for them while they play the games of Divinity.
Yeah, and it's very, very sort of Chinese mythological here that the entire cast of gods, even the Unconquered Sun, their great king and all that, they're all middle managers. That's what they were made to be.
Yes, that's kind of reflecting the idea of heaven as a bureaucracy, which is very, very Chinese. But the gods were created initially to run creation. They got jealous of the Primordials and said, "Oi, we want to spend all our time playing games now." And so they give part of their power to create the exaltations. I don't want to get into precisely how that else is.
There's time for that in the alchemical episode.
There will be time for that in the alchemical episode. But the Solars were created by the Unconquered Sun to be the generals and rulers of this new world order. And most particularly, they were made to defeat the Primordials. Because when the Primordials created the gods, they had "and you cannot harm us" bit in their code. So the gods could not directly rebel against the Primordials. Oh, and if you're looking in the 3rd edition materials, looking for the term Primordials, you are not going to find it. They are a bit more nebulously referred to as the enemies of the gods, and that sort of thing. But if you look at the previous edition's materials, you will know what they're talking about.
And equally, every part of the community will still refer to them as Primordials, because 3rd edition changed the name and then still had all of the same things about them be in effect.
Yes, which is why we can talk about this whole process with as much detail as we have. So, the Solars were created as the generals. They led the war against the Primordials and aided in the slaying of some of the Primordials who...
3 of them. This was a bad idea.
Yes, generally speaking, because Primordials were not designed to die. Dying is not in their makeup, so bad things happened. However, as they were losing, the Primordials cursed the Exalted, which has many and various effects. This is called the Great Curse. And the way that it's manifest in Solars, I mean, for pretty much all of the Exalted, it's some form of hubris, but it's more the case for the Solars, I feel, than anything else.
The Solars, it's your very classic Herculean hubris. Like, the other ones tend to lean into their unique supernatural flavours a lot more, whereas the solar manifestation of the Great Curse, if they didn't tell you that this was put on them by crazy evil super demon mega beasts, you could believe that, yeah, a person's just having a bit of an episode.
Yeah, again, kind of leaning on the classical stuff. Achilles just stomping off and sulking in his tent because his friend or his lover, depending on your reading of that, is dead, while everyone else gets slaughtered around him, is kind of a consequence of this. Eventually, Solars will just snap and give in to their worst impulses, whether that's slaughtering millions themselves, leaving it open for it to be possible for others to do them, going completely over the top with their own forms of retribution or justice in inverted commas. So if someone is stealing to feed their family, a Solar who is subject to the Great Curse may well kill them and their entire family. Things like that. It was meant to be a kind of, well, if you want to order creation this way, it's going to go badly, done by the Primordials.
Unfortunately, the Unconquered Sun proceeded to, knowing this, continue to just order creation like that anyway.
And this is why you shouldn't play too many computer games, kids.
To be fair, it didn't go wrong immediately.
No, this is true, which is why we have the First Age, which is also why Exalted is technically post-apocalyptic, because the First Age is an age of unparalleled wonders where Solars created marvels that ordered creation, made life wonderful for everyone so that they could carry on living, finding out new things, binding demons to their will as their slaves and everything else, and
the grass
it's
was
all
literally
wonderful.
Greener, the world was literally wider.
Yes, creation was bigger because the people running the system could actually do things to enforce creation's boundaries against the wild. Basically, imagine a tech utopia, but with magic. That's the image that particularly 2nd edition portrays of the First Age.
Even 3rd does to a limited degree, because we have in there, First Age Ruins is byword for Magitech Bonanza. In the city of Chiaroscuro, which gets a surprising amount of detail in the 3rd edition core, they have again, not to put too fine a point on it, an apartment complex with lifts and plumbing. And this is listed as an amazing super wonder because it was built in the First Age. And yes, technically it's all run on Magitech as compared to regular tech, but it is, to you or I, the players, as compared to you or I, the characters, look at that, that's an apartment complex. It's got flats in it, it's got plumbing and electric lighting. But in a fantasy Bronze Age sort of world, that's horrifyingly magical.
Yes, and this is all the stuff that got made while the Solars and all of their happy family buddies were running the world. Eventually, the Primordial's curse kind of turns, and you get people who have these levers on all of these wonderful, wonderful things that make the world work are going to go nuts and throw tantrums, slaughter millions of innocents because they woke up on the wrong side of the bed that morning. I'm possibly oversimplifying. I'm massively oversimplifying, but...
And yet not over-exaggerating as much as it may sound. Equally, the one thing I will sort of say with this is, the Great Curse, we know how it works, we know what it does. The amount to which any of the atrocities happened is up for debate because of what happened as a result of all of the atrocities that happened and who was behind it.
Yes, because all of this stuff was happening, people were descending steadily into madness and chaos, and the streets were running with blood and all the rest of it, and if you believe some of the official accounts, in inverted commas, then it was quite as bad as pre-fall Eldar, if you're familiar with Warhammer 40,000, but there were some Exalted that decided that this needed to end. If the Solars carried on their current course, they would destroy the world, because something would go wrong, someone would snap at the wrong time, and just pull the plug on reality, because they would have the ability to do that.
And so the wonderfully named Chejop Kajak, who is still canon, so we can still laugh at his silly name, decided, in all of his wonderful wisdom, him being powerful and authoritative, but for the kind of Exalt that he is, effectively in his mid-20s at the time, he was very young when it happened, he decided that the best solution to the looming crisis of hubris and madness and all of these things that the Solars have, it's not to try and mediate it. As both lore and mechanics say, you can, if you actually just sort of, for you better take care of the Solars a bit, they will be able to calm down and come back from this without doing too much harm. No, he decides genocide is the best solution.
Well, he did kind of have his reasons, at least in previous editions. Some of the previous editions explicitly says that there was a prophecy that spoke about what would happen if the Solars carried on their present course. That there was a chance that the world would be destroyed, or there was a chance that it would move on to ever greater wonder. But also, if the Solars were destroyed, then the world would definitely survive. And so Chejop and his pals decide that survival is better than possible wonder. So they
twirl their moustaches and get a scheming.
Well, yeah.
That's what sidereals do.
Pretty much. They persuade the Dragon-Blooded, the foot soldiers of the Divine Revolution, which I think is... I don't know if it's a term that's applied anywhere, but...
It's not the term anymore, it used to be, as with so many things. Basically, the... I almost said prequel era, which is worryingly too Star Wars for that, but a lot of the ancient history of Exalted, for some reason, 3rd edition has just changed all of the names, but nothing else.
I think the reason for that is so that it remains sufficiently vague that if you want to include it, or if you want to change it, then you can. That's my feeling, because I certainly get the feeling with the 2nd edition materials, because everything has a name, then you can pull names into lots of situations and say, well, this is thing X, and thing X is also referenced here, 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 here. It must be a really important thing. And so everything becomes about very high stakes, and also very easy to trace back to the causes of Exalted and the Divine Revolution itself, and everything ancient history, which kind of pulls the story away from what your player characters are doing. It makes it less about their own adventures and their place in a greater cosmic scheme. And 3rd edition was very consciously trying to make it the story about heroes and what everything that means, rather than something that is dealing with cosmic scale consequences. You'll get to that. You'll absolutely get to dealing with cosmic scale consequences, but quite what they are can vary in 3rd edition in a way that you would probably get more people up in arms around 2nd edition if they knew the setting, because so much was defined and tied down.
Yeah. Although this sort of ties back into the more broader thing of, oddly, I do genuinely think that Exalted games are always going to be running smoothest when you, the storyteller, know the setting and they, the players, don't.
I can't disagree.
It's not even a, haha, I know everything sort of thing. It's more... This is true in lots of things, but especially in Exalted, the setting is as much a character as any of the players are, and discovering it is part of the fun.
Yes. And we've veered wildly off.
Back to the history!
Yes, back to the history. The Sidereals conspired with the Dragon-Blooded to overthrow the Solars. This had to be managed carefully, because if you just kill them, they just reincarnate. I don't know if it's necessarily that it's been said anywhere that memories of past lives were clearer anywhere around the First Age.
One of the dreams of the First Age books, which is an old second edition thing for running them in the First Age, it's not that the memories were clearer, it's just that back in those days they knew the techniques to actually meditate on and recover them, which have now been lost to the mists of time.
Yep, that makes sense.
Which then opens for, in your modern game, you can have someone rediscover it.
So the Sidereals had to conspire to capture all of the Sparks of Exaltation as they died and lock them away somewhere. So while the Dragon-Blooded were off murdering all of the Solars and as many of the Lunars as they could get their hands on...
The Lunars kind of ran away.
Lunars did kind of run away. That's a very fair comment, and we won't say any more than that because we'll deal with that in the Lunars episode.
They killed all the Solars and all their families. This was a straight up, you can read it as a slaying of the firstborn level, knock on the door, shunk shunk, done. It's straight up the thing of one of the minor little monsters, and I love this, every tiny thing can have little notes to what this might be. One of the little monsters that gets mentioned in some of the books is a little thing called the Chilokin, which is the best way that I tell the story about the usurpation. The Chilokins were all made, you only find them in the Scavenger Lands, because all of them that were made by one Twilight back in the First Age. A Chilokin is basically a gibbon. It's about yay big, it's got a little gem in its forehead. They're really, really cute, they're really, really docile, they really, really like people, and they sustain themselves by eating nightmares and replacing them with good dreams. They're adorable little cuddly friends that this Twilight made for both his family, but also for just children of people in general as a companion, especially for those that were the mortal children of the Solars, whose parents were going to be not only busy, but also immortal, and so they would have to deal with that horrifying thing of watch your family grow old and die around you while you're fine. But they get a lovely little cuddly friend. All of the Chilokins by the time of the Age of Sorrows, which is the modern period, are insane and try to kill Dragonbloods on sight because they were all horrendously traumatized by their retinue. Their children that were their friends, they were sorcerously hard-coded to see these people as best friend, were cut down in cold blood.
Yes, this period is called the usurpation in the settings because essentially it's a coup by the Dragon-Blooded over the Solars. One way you can look at it. I don't know if it's ever called that anywhere in... It's probably called that by Lunars.
I thought the Lunars had an uglier name for it that I can't remember. The Sidereals pretty much call it that. And the Dragons have a nicer, prettier sounding name for it.
Yeah, figures.
Everyone has a different name for it because it was a big scary event.
As the dust settles, and most of the Solars, but not all, are rounded up and sealed away in the Jade Prison, which, again, 3rd edition tries to make it fuzzy. It does make it less definite. They were sealed away in the Jade Prison, which was then dumped into the ocean somewhere. There were some solar exaltations that escaped that, and so there was the need for the institution of the Wild Hunt to chase them down and contain them wherever they were found before they came into their powers, and it's easier to do when they're young because they don't know what they're doing. Yep.
More than just a Wild Hunt, the Sidereals, the shady masterminds behind all of this, realised that, yeah, okay, this plan isn't going to be perfect. Maybe some Solars will come back. We kind of lost track of a couple of thousand Lunars, and we know they won't be hiding away from us forever. They got to make sure that not just their Dragon-Blooded, not quite servants, because how aware the Dragon-Bloods were of who was pulling the strings is really vague, and that's the only bit that is vague across all the editions. We don't know if they were servants or stooges, and it could be either, because the Sidereals are slimy.
Yes.
But they got to work making sure that the average person would absolutely despise these things. We've talked about the Immaculate Philosophy before, and the big dramatic plot twist here is it's all a lie told by these Machiavellian gremlins.
I would argue that. I seem to be coming out as a realm apologist as this conversation goes on. It's the difference between telling a simple lie and having with a complex truth behind it. That, on the one hand, Solars as evil demons who will eventually take over all the world if you let them, and therefore must be killed as soon as we hear about them, is kind of a lie. But the idea that they may seem beguiling, they may seem like they want to do something, but they will eventually go mad and destroy everything, is kind of a replay of the First Era.
Yeah, although the reason that I'm a lot harsher on it is entirely because not only did they make sure that everyone hates the Solars with that big smear campaign, and the Lunars as well, but you don't hear about that as much, but then they also decided to make sure that they also told everyone, and these Dragonbloods, the guys that we have wrapped around our fingers, they are the higher spiritual beings that you should listen to all the time, and they are directly to blame for the state that the modern realm is in for saying that bit. And then they proceeded to write themselves out of the picture because they know that by their definition of anathema, they look like one.
Yes, absolutely. There is a good amount of hypocrisy in how the Sidereals handled it. But, yeah, I can still see that it kind of makes sense.
Raelz says take a torch to your local monastery.
Oh dear. Yeah, but there is explicit points in the game that say, yes, the Immaculate Philosophy is genuinely fulfilling and helps maintain order for an awful lot of people. Oh, yeah. But anyway, we're getting...
Back into this. We'll have a Theological Fight Club episode later.
Yes, absolutely. Are we ever actually on track? I'm increasingly thinking that we very rarely are, but we'll get there.
We'll go back at some point and keep track of the few moments we're on point. Fast forward a couple of thousand years in which really nothing too important happened, just 2 apocalypses and 3 whole governments.
Yeah, it's important for the setting, but it's not important for Solars, which is why we're skipping it for now.
When the prison starts to crack, and this is by the cracks appearing in that, if they are, well, there's rumours that they were making that TV series, if they're clever, that box cracking is the intro, or the trailer, or both. Because that's really where you as a Solar, that's where your story begins, when things start slipping out of that box. And it's not the whole thing's open. All the Solars aren't back, and they probably, without player interference, they probably wouldn't be for several more hundred, maybe even 1,000 or so years, because it's a trickle, is what they are very clear to say.
Because otherwise you would end up with Solars in various corners doing horrible things, and that's only happening in a few places, which we'll get to. But yeah, it's cracked, and it's cracked due to interventions by various powers. You remember those sore losers in the Divine War? They've been interfering.
They got turned inside out and shoved inside their leader's bloated body. There's no two ways around that. That's what the Yozis are. Hell isn't a place, it's a corpse.
It's a corpse that can't die, so it transmutes.
Yes, and everyone in it is angry about being that.
Yes. And so there was efforts made to overturn the created order, and one of the steps to that is breaking the Jade Prison. And as part of said cracking, several of the Solar Exaltations got handed over to the Yozis.
Yes, you're right. It wasn't just the Ebon Dragon. This is again older lore because we don't name the Yozis anymore, but it was 5 of them. Because back in 2nd edition, Infernals had 5 castes, just like Solars did, and so they said that it was 5 of the important Yozis that did it, and it was the Ebon Dragon, it was Malpheus himself, it was Ceciline, it was Adajan, and it was she who lives in her name.
That's fair enough. And yes, it was because it was a bargain that it was only pulled off because of the involvement of the Yozis, and the Yozis did it on condition that they receive those exaltations as part of it.
Other way around, the Neverborn were the necessary party. The Ebon Dragon wanted it to happen, but the Yozis, in a wonderful twist of fate, just like how the gods were bound with the promise of you cannot do anything against us when the Primordials were in charge, when they imprisoned all of the Primordials and made them into the Yozis, they put the same sort of thing on them, of you cannot do anything against us. So the Yozis are bound and cannot act against the gods, and have only limited ability to act against creation 5 days a year. But the Neverborn, which were the 3 ones that died, except they didn't because them dying is not a possibility in the laws of physics, and are the reason there's an underworld. The Neverborn are even weirder. If the Yozis are Chaos Gods, the Neverborn are Cthulhu-level things. But they were necessary because they're not bound by the same rules. There was a deal, the Exaltations, some of them went to the Yozis, some of them went to the Neverborn, who then gave them to the Death Lords.
These are all different ways of twisting the Solar Exaltation. When the Solar Exaltation is assigned to a different patron, then weird things happen to it. And it's a way of those types of players using the game of Exaltation as the ways to do that. Whether or not the release of the Solars from the Jade Prison was anything to do with the Scarlet Empress disappearing is kind of not really answered anywhere I've seen, but it happens around about the same time.
Yes. There is one place that answers that question, but it's the 2nd edition adventure paths, which they're a whole thing. I will say the very quick thing of, it was a wedding present, and we'll get into it at some point when we cover the madness that is the 2nd edition adventure paths.
Yeah, and probably the Scarlet Empress and all the rest of it. So the general point of all that, and from a thematic level, is to get the impression of everything is new, everything is 1 minute to midnight sort of theme for the games. So everything is designed to be just about to go horribly wrong or horribly right, depending on what perspective is useful for any narrative. And then your Solars come in, swoop in, and do something to pull it one way or another.
Creation hates you but doesn't know how to deal with you, so you have a convincing, the whole world is against you thing, but not the whole world is actually organised against you.
Yes, absolutely. Over the course of the history since the usurpation, the Wild Hunt was designed to combat those few Solars that were still around, as we said, but that's deteriorated over time. Wild Hunts still happen, and they are still quite dangerous.
It's the default Dragonblood game.
But they're still kind of not at full strength by any stretch of the imagination. And so, Solars at least have a chance. Part of this is done for balance reasons, but it also feeds into the setting.
Yeah, and it's equally one of the key bits that is, again, and there is no onus on players or storytellers to do this, but the setting does sort of kind of imply at it of the way you as a Solar do this is by, just like how the Cid's got the average everyday peasant Jim on his side with spreading the religion, you, the Solars, convince them of, look, we're great and we're here to help, and that's how you win. You win by being a hero.
Yes, in whatever sense that means. And I think that's about it for the kind of general intro to Solars or else. If you have any questions at all, do drop us an email and we will answer it when we get to it at wondrousatlas@gmail.com. We are both individually on Twitter. I'm at Aramithius, Raelz is at Raelz, and most importantly, there is also the show at Wondrous Atlas on Twitter. If you want to find us there, ping us anything, and we will get to answering it in an episode. If we can talk about it in ramble and go horribly off topic.
Send us your angry letters about my opinions on sidereals.
Absolutely, we need to fuel this. I can sense some arguments brewing down the line, shall we say. And so any and all fuel to that fire would be great to have. And thank you ever so much for listening. If you are a player, I would recommend that you stop listening now. We are going to transition to our section, which is going to be focused on talking about Solars as story hooks or story hooks for Solar games. So this is going to be much more storyteller focused than the section we've just had has been. So if you're a player for Exalted, thank you ever so much for listening, and we will catch you next time when we are talking about Lunars. Thank you for listening to the Wondrous Atlas of Creation's Destiny, an Exalted podcast presented by Aramithius and Raelz. Check out the show notes and story seeds from this episode at wondrousatlas.wordpress.com, and if you have any questions, drop us an email at wondrousatlas@gmail.com. The opening music for this podcast is Travelling to the Blessed Isle by James Semple, and the closing music is Exploring Creation, also by James Semple. Both tracks are taken from the album Exalted, Dreams of the Second Age, and are property of Onyx Path Publishing, used with permission. Actually, before we get to all that, there were a few things that I've managed to notice that we slipped up on. I managed to completely get my Greek mythology wrong, misconstruing the role of Patroclus in the Iliad and what he made Achilles do. It wasn't that when he died, Achilles went and sulked. It was Achilles didn't want to fight and stayed in his tent because Agamemnon was trying to do things to Achilles' wife, and it was the murder of Patroclus that brought Achilles out of his sulking and into a murderous rampage. So my
apologies to all of those classicists out there who probably screamed that something was going wrong. And also, one of the things that we did miss out that was fairly substantial with the Solars was Eclipse charms. Did we just want to give a quick explanation for what those are, just so that we get completeness?
The one-sentence explanation is basically Eclipse castes can steal charms from what would be the monster manual if Exalted ever had a good one. Charms are sometimes listed as Eclipse, and that means that by learning them, or by using other Eclipse charms, or by just generally having a fun old time, Eclipse Caste Solars can take them, even though they are supposed to be charms for monsters, or sometimes other Exalts. I don't know if Third has had other Exalts get Eclipse charms. I know Second did.
I've not noticed any so far, but then again, I kind of see charms and my eyesight goes very blurry and I tend to glaze after a certain amount of time. But yeah, it's basically allowing the Eclipses to perform the role of ambassador that little bit more. It's kind of the perks of living in a foreign land, so to speak.
It's yet another reason that every single character archetype can be an Eclipse cast, because they can have a much wider charm library than anyone else.
Yes, as well as potentially even stealing charms from gods, as it turns out, because you can get spirit charms as well as part of that whole deal. And I think with that...
The bull.
The bull.
We forgot the bull.
That's fair enough. We did forget the bull until we dropped the storyteller screen down. And in terms of the flavour, the Bull of the North is basically the example of everything that you can do as a Solar, or many things you can do as a Solar. He basically went up against one of the most storied military great houses of the Dragon-Blooded and totally decimated their legions. He absolutely wiped the floor with them. But after that, he more or less stopped. He was supposedly coming south and sweeping a whole bunch of cities up in his wake, but he's more or less stopped after he smacked Tepet. He and, in previous editions, several of his circle are good examples of what Solar Warlords can achieve. In some ways, it can be something for you to hook characters up with. Everyone's heard of the Bull of the North. You can travel to find him, get guidance from him, that sort of thing. Or potentially oppose him, depending on what your story arc is.
And it's also a very sort of relevant thing for your freshly exalted Solar to think of themselves in terms of.
Yes. Something that's not just the Immaculates telling stories about how you're the great bogeyman of their faith and something dreadful. You've got a big example of a recent Solar who's managed to accrue a good amount of power, and you can see what they can do. I think we probably need to unpack how creation works in relation to everything else, because we haven't so far. Because if you are unaware of what the world of creation is in Exalted as a physical world, it is flat. The maps you will see are square. I see in my head that it's ultimately a rhombus or diamond shape.
Yeah, raggedy diamond.
The reason for that is that it is a little patch of ordered stuff in a roiling sea of chaos.
Held down with 5 big nails.
Yes, that sea of chaos is called the Wild. The 5 big nails that are holding it down are the elemental poles. The elemental pole of Earth is in the middle of creation and is also the Imperial Mountain, right slap bang in the middle of the Blessed Isle.
It's the most stable one. It's why in older editions, you don't see fairies on the Imperial Isle. In Third, you just don't see them as much.
Yes. You then have the elemental pole of air in the north. So the further north you get, or closer you get towards the pole of air, it gets colder, it gets more windy, and ultimately you just wind up with a blinding blizzard as you get to the pole.
Also, elemental air is key to lightning, because it's also electric. Important for magic, because the pole of air is a big column of lightning.
You then head east, and you get to the elemental pole of wood, where the forests just get denser and denser and denser, and eventually something out there will kill you.
The trees get bigger, the shadows get deeper, and the things in them get scarier. I also like to imagine that the pole of wood is just a very big tree.
Yeah, I don't see it as being anything else. From what I can see, with how everything goes, the majority of your beast folk will be in this direction.
Yes. You don't have many details about the elemental poles because, as we've sort of mentioned so far with these two, the environment gets a lot more hostile the closer you get to them, so even in universe it's not really mapped. It's a here be dragons kind of danger zone. But the east is the one that you can theoretically get the closest to, because it's not... If you walk far enough north or south, you die, and you can't walk far enough west.
It's also the one most associated with life. I don't know whether it's gone far enough that if you kill whatever's trying to kill you, then it comes right back, if you get near enough, but it would not surprise me.
There's mileage for an Abyssal game out there, you know.
Oh yeah. If you go south, you have the elemental pole of fire, so you further south you go, everything gets drier and more sandy and everything. I don't know whether things perish more quickly out there, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Things get dry, things get more volcanic.
Yes.
And the pole of fire itself is a column of flame. The southern pole is more notable because in the desert down south there, it's the one whose influence is felt the furthest away from it, if that makes sense. The southern desert becomes inhospitable quite early in, basically.
Yep. And to the west, we have the elemental pole of water, which is where the sea meets the sky, is how I've seen it described.
The ocean just keeps going. Yeah. It gets to the point where there aren't any more islands, and you don't have the provisions. But yes, it's inside the wild, which is your endless sea of primordial chaos. People get offended whenever you describe the wild as anything, because everyone has a different idea on what it should be. But it's the crazy primordial chaos. When we keep describing fairies and the fae, technically they're this. They are the chaos. They were here before the world was made, and they find it really, really quite rude that you're trying to impose this existing thing on them.
Yeah, although there's an ambivalence there, because...
They love it and they hate it.
Yes, the fair folk both hate that it exists and find it really tasty.
The wild is the ocean here. Creation is a block nailed into it. There are 3 other planes, and I think we do just have to get the brief plane of cosmology over. There is heaven, which is it directly above in third? It used to be. Now it might just be nebulously transcendental.
It's not been set as to where it is. And I think it was even kind of floating away slightly in second, because there were places that you could access it, and they weren't implied to be lifts.
No, the gates are one thing, but they're interplanar. I just remember because the Day Star was a thing. But anyway, heaven, it's where the gods hang out.
It's also a bureaucracy.
Oh, yes.
Because Exalted takes a lot of its inspiration from Chinese history and Chinese understandings of the cosmos. Heaven is a bureaucracy. Gods administrate how the world works, and everything that means. So you have your gods of rocks in small streams, gods of individual fields. The higher up the hierarchy you go, the more you technically have responsibility for, and the more prayer you can get, and the more likely you are to get a plush office in Yushan.
Yushan as well. Heaven, Yushan, these terms are synonymous. Heaven isn't a fun cloud with pretty angels and cupids on it. It's a city with apartments and roads and policemen who are lions, but that's separate. But yeah, heaven, quite nice, all things considered. The other 2 planes aren't. There's the underworld, which I mentioned before that necromancy was a metaphysical crime. We'll save most of it for the Abyssal episode, but the underworld basically is a mistake. It's where creation broke a little.
Yes. Going from the history, the beings that weren't supposed to die and physically couldn't die, did die, were killed, and as a result, the cycle of reincarnation, which is how things should work, doesn't always work that way, and the underworld is the not corpse honest gov of these beings, and that's where some spirits end up.
No, the underworld isn't a corpse. The underworld's a hole. The underworld is just a hole, it's a crack. Because Malpheus, otherwise known as Hell, is the inside-out corpse of a god, with demons in it, and other gods in it.
Just to make that difference, because when I first heard of these terms, I thought, hang on, aren't they really similar? The beings that created the underworld are the Neverborn, because they died, in inverted commas, but they couldn't. And you've also got Malpheus, which is also the same class of being as the Neverborn.
Not dead.
Yes, not dead, exactly. So describing it as a corpse is not strictly accurate.
Yes, okay. The mutilated inside-out body of a god of a primordial Titan. Let's use the Greek because that's what they were ripping off.
Yes.
The inside-out body of a Titan who is really, really angry about being inside out and having all of his co-Titans inside his inside-out body and demons in it. The only notable difference between what the popular perception will be and the general terms of hell and the underworld, people don't go to Malpheus unless they're trying to. It's not somewhere you end up as punishment or whatever. The only people that go there are wizards, because they're trying to do wizard things. Whereas the underworld, when you die, it's a 50-50 on if you reincarnate or go there. It's not quite 50-50, there are ways to influence it, but sometimes you reincarnate, sometimes you just turn into a ghost and go downstairs, and it's a perfect mirror of creation. But those are the planes. They will have their own episodes later.
Yes, that's just so that you can get a rough understanding of how the planes work.
And just some quick errata that has come up in some of the conversations we've been having on the channel that's on the Exalted Discord for this podcast. And mostly this is all coming from Black, who's been very diligent in keeping us in line with where we should be. And there's been some interesting conversations around these various bits in the meantime, but some of the bits that we can absolutely say, yes, we were wrong, hold our hands up, and just clarify a few things. Can you get to unpacking the five elemental dragons thing to start us off?
The five elemental dragons as distinct from the five immaculate dragons and as direct descendants stroke third level demons of Gaia, technically third level Deva if you want to be really specific, is weird because it was fanon and then it is canon. Initially, they were just gods who happened to be the children of Gaia, which doesn't make sense when you actually know how both of those two entities work, but okay. Up until the Autoxonia books in 2nd edition, where finally we saw some elemental poles that weren't the normal ones, and it focused really hard on how does an intact primordials hierarchy of spirits look. Here's something that needs a bit of clarification. We've had a bit of a back and forth, as you've just heard, about the difference in the roles between a Zenith Caste and an Eclipse Caste. In our errata, we've had a nice way of phrasing it put down as a soft power versus hard power distinction. The difference between a leader, being the Zenith, and a diplomat in the form of the Eclipse.
Yeah, so it's a question of the Eclipse being the one who talks and does the backroom deals and just is very, very subtle about everything they do, whereas the Zenith is the social battering ram who shouts and yells and is up front and is busy being inspiring and shining and obvious, and yeah, everything that follows from that distinction. We also have another point on the date of the usurpation. I think we were a bit fuzzy about it in the episode itself. It's about 1,200 to 1,500 years before present day within the current 3rd edition timelines.
Which, weirdly, when you actually do the maths on it, means the Shogunate lasted about as long as the realm has.
Funny.
We're in realm year 760 something or other. So you chop that in half. Chunk, chunk.
768, yes. Is this the point where we say, all of this has happened before, all of this will happen again?
Well, I mean, look, as players in a game of Exalted, you are there at the dawning of the Third Age.
Yes, this is true.
Right. 3rd edition has made a choice. It's being an ambiguity. It's not made a hard choice here. They are no longer confirming that the Death Lords are all solar ghosts. We have had in our errata someone say this to try and phrase as if they are no longer solar ghosts, as opposed to it not being mentioned. Which sparks a bit of a further discussion, because thematically, I think if they actually do hard confirm that the Death Lords are not solar, it makes them worse. It takes away the only opportunity for a loyal Abyssal game to be moral. Which, if you want the Death Lords to be hard, pure villains, fine, that works. But Exalted has been weird in that it kind of hasn't had any pure, hard villains.
Yeah, you're going to have to explain a bit about why the Death Lords quite have a case there, I think.
Right, yeah. So, you run with the fact that the Death Lords are solar ghosts. We don't know who all of them used to be. We know who a few of them used to be. We know that the Mask of Winter's name was Larquin, which I'm never going to let anyone forget because he was called Larquin.
I bet he went to some horrific preparatory school.
Larquin Chuen was his name, or potentially Quan, because the people writing second may not have known that they were writing something that looked Chinese. I'm going to read it like it's Chinese because Larquin Chuen sounds nicer. We know that. You take that they're all solar ghosts. If you were a solar who died, especially since a bunch of them are implied to have died in the usurpation, a few of them are older, but a bunch of them are implied to have died then, If you were a Solar and saw that happen, saw your Age of Wonders come down because everyone turned on you all at once, you'd feel quite slighted, especially if you died in it. Especially if you died to protect it before, then what did I die for? I died for nothing, and the world has gotten worse. It makes their whole take over the world shtick, which is a bit pinky in the brain, but it makes it almost justified in a sort of anti-hero kind of way, because they were wronged, and they have seen a better world. They remember sometimes remember a better world. A few of them are amnesiacs, but they remember a better world, and you all ruined it. And it allows you to be working for, especially since in every edition, there's always a few ideas of, there are more Death Lords than we're telling you about, make one of yours here, where you can have a genuinely, no, I remember I want to make things better one. And yes, they're still working with the Neverborn, who are a problem, but they're not all worshipful of them. You can have it a case of, I need this power to do what I must, sort of scenario.
I'm almost sort of imagining the case, just hearing that, the idea of almost the moral Tyler Durden case, the kind of tear the world down and make something new again, and because I remember how it was and how it should be.
Yeah, it helps for them, and I like it because I like we mentioned Infernals in this episode as well, I can go on this little tangent. I like it with Infernals as well, that the two most obvious bad guy-looking splats both actually have really strong moral cases for why they're doing what they're doing. Because there is no group in creation that has been wronged more than the Primordials.
Okay, just some small bits of clarification now on the Primordials themselves. We've mentioned before that Gaia is creation. That isn't the case. She was quite a large part of its construction, or took part in quite a large bit of its construction, and Raelz can tell us a bit more about that, because it's not just Gaia lying down and stuff happens.
Yeah, and she isn't lying down and being the Earth, because she's mostly up in Yushan now, hanging out with her girlfriend. She got a good ending out of this, by betraying her entire family. I have issues with Gaia. But yeah, no, she isn't her Jotun form. For those of you who know what a Jotun form is, that's the geographical expression of a primordial. In Malpheus, it's the regions of hell. In Autochthonia, it's the spaceship you're walking around in. Every primordial has a part of it that is geography, because of course they do. Hers isn't creation itself. She just made that. When you look around and see the world, most of what you think is what Gaia made. She made the land, she made the water, she made the wind, she made the wood, she made the fire. The 5 elements, that's her. The poles are actually different because they're a metaphysical thing, but the actual elements that they're around, that's Gaia. Her sister, Cytherea, the Mother of Mystery, although that's her Yosi name, I don't know her primordial one, I don't think we ever got it, did the rest of the stuff. The animals, and there's debate as to whether she did humans.
Mm-hmm.
One book says she does, another says someone else did. I run that she did, because it makes a nice little parallel between the land and the life, but you have multiple primordials that claim they made humanity, because Autochthon is also supposed to have done it, but did he really? But yes, she isn't Earth itself. You can kind of sometimes, if you're a very, very high-end sorcerer, communicate to her through it, yes, but she isn't the Earth. She just built it. Although some of the Earth is her children. But
we'll get to that.
We'll get to dragons. So, Dragonbloods. 3rd edition has changed a little bit of the Dragonblooded role in the Divine Revolution. It's moved them from foot soldiers up to the officer corps, which is a nice promotion from them, because it is claiming that the armies of the gods contained all of humanity. I have problems.
Yeah, the armies are a lot more involved in 3rd edition. They have a lot more moving parts going on. And we don't hear enough about those moving parts to know how they work or what they did, which is slightly infuriating, but there's more potential raw material to work with there. Beforehand, in previous editions, Dragonblooded were the foot soldiers of the Divine Revolution. In 3rd, that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, I have issues mostly because then it starts implying... Again, we haven't had any on-the-ground viewpoints in 3rd of the Divine Revolution, but we did in 2nd. Humans aren't standing up to that.
I've just had a sudden realisation, actually. If humans were involved in the Divine Revolution as part of the armies of the gods, shouldn't the humans get a great curse as well?
Their great curse is the curse of irrelevancy, and it is why 3rd edition and all editions of Exalted run as mortals do not matter.
Possibly.
There we go. I've just upset a bunch of 3rd edition people who think that 3rd fixes that problem. It doesn't.
No.
But yeah, the lack of a great curse implies that they didn't really do much, or at least if they did, they didn't contribute much. But the only thing I could think that humans could serve to do in that kind of warfare, given what the primordials were like and the kinds of things they were fielding against the gods, is meat shield to absorb some of the early blows.
Yeah, which would probably wipe a lot of them out anyway. But yes, we've just been talking about the war between the primordials and the gods. Just to clarify, there is some different terminology between the editions as well. It's called the Divine Revolution or the War of the Gods in the 3rd edition. It's called the Primordial War in 2nd, and does not get a name in 1st edition at all.
Divine Revolution is the coolest term. It's the one we're going to keep using.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rule of cool applies.
And before we move on to some timeline shenanigans, further clarification on terminology. The early books in 3rd edition call the primordials the enemies of the gods and make it vague. We've had some mention of them being titans in essence, and we've had some of the more recent books call them the ancients. So they're not using the term primordials because they want to disassociate them with 2nd edition portrayals, presumably, but we do have the term the ancients to stick to them. We're probably going to go along with primordials because we're both in agreement that that sounds cooler, but I think we will be using other terms as they come up.
Yes. So, timeline. 3rd edition has changed the timeline a little bit on the first age. They've made it longer. It's about 5,000 years now, whereas before it was about 3,500, 4,000-ish, depending on how you want to count it. It's a bit longer than it used to be. Okay, we've got something that's going to be controversial here. We have some numbers. Now, we've mentioned how, no matter which way you count it, the numbers of exalts is weird.
Yes.
We have something purporting to be canon numbers, thanks to Black for giving them, on the books and comments from the devs. Now, we have strong opinions about these, and we'll get into them once we've read them out, but presenting as they are being given, there are about, I assume as of today, as of 768, 150 solars, 100 abyssals, 50 infernals, 100 sidereals, 300 to 400 lunars, 25,000 dragonbloods.
Approximately.
Yeah, all of these are approximate.
Apart from infernals and lunars, if we're going on the list we've been given.
Although this could just be type formatting. 250 liminals, exigents, a rough number between 100 and 300. 64 Getimians, which I assume is an exact number, otherwise that's a very specific reference, and 1,000 alchemicals. I'm going to be generous and assume that means total on creation and in Autochthonia, because if there's more alchemicals than there are anything else other than dragons hanging around, the dragons aren't running creation anymore. I'm sorry. So, these numbers are weird on several counts. First and foremost, okay, this is purely me being a 2nd edition head, this implies that there's still about 100 solars locked in the box, locked in the Jade Prison. These numbers are for everything other than Dragonbloods, and maybe Sidereals depending on how you want to count it. These numbers are all smaller than they used to be. But solars and lunars, I had, because of various 2nd edition sources, always assumed to be of equal number, whatever that number was. Because part of the reason that 2nd edition posits the bond being more universal, whereas 3rd posits it's optional, that necessitates there being an equal number of them. If everyone has a bond, and no one has more than one, which is the other part of the way that bond works, then there have to be equal numbers. So that's a bit weird.
Unless you're leaving out that there are still some solars to come out of the Jade Prison. That might well be the explainer.
Yeah, like I said, there's about 100 solars still in the box. That could do it. But then again, 3rd says that it's optional whether or not you have the bond at all, which if you read that as not everyone was made with it, then it means that, yeah, there can be an equal number. Weird that Luna got away with having more, given how the Unconquered Sun is personality-wise. Dragonbloods is an odd number. Mostly because 10,000 is traditionally put up as the number the realm has. And What Fire Has Wrought mentions that there's probably about as many beyond its borders. 5,000 has appeared from somewhere here.
Kind of on the fringes, maybe, but it's nebulous. It's just...
it's much of a muchness. Yeah, there's a bucket load. Yeah,
Dragon-blooded, there are as many as you need there to be, which I think goes for most of this, to be fair.
And Getimians, in particular, weirdly, despite me normally being more of a 2nd edition head, Getimians is the number here that upsets me the most. Because Getimians, for those of you listening in the distant future where we have actual solid material for them. In the early days of 3rd edition, whether that's because the book was being ambiguous, because 3rd edition core book is very ambiguous about lots of things, or whether it is because there was genuinely a different concept, Getimians looked a lot different to what they do now. Now, Getimians have their seasonal casts, and they are... not to give them their own episode here, but they're kind of the result of aborted timelines. When time and fate go wrong and they have to snip one out, a Getimian is someone from a timeline that got cut, falling through, and being from the wrong world and all of that fun stuff. Early Getimians weren't quite phrased as that. They were tied a lot more closely to the war in heaven. The civil war that they said the Bureau of Destiny was having, the Sidereals. They posited the Getimians as a force led directly by Rakan Thulio, the traitor Sidereal, who we'll get to eventually in one of these episodes, is actually the most justified hero in the entire setting. That they were Sidereals who used internal alchemy to divorce themselves from the loom of fate and have funny paradox powers. 64 works for that, where they're all ex-Sidereals. It makes it weird that there's 164 Sids, or we assume that approximately means that there's whatever there was, less 64. It doesn't work when they're just the drop-throughs from that and they're not organised, because given how much of a problem they are for Fate, if there's just 64 of them and they're not big and organised under Rakan like the rogue Getimians, as I'm going to have to start calling that concept, were, they're not a threat. They're getting removed, because even the Sidereals aren't so incompetent that 64 time glitches is a major issue for them.
Well, I don't know whether the Getimian time glitches are big, is the thing. But if it's large-scale change, then yes, it's proper panic stations.
Well, they're celestial tier, so they should be. It's basically the thing of... That 64 strikes me as if it was two different concepts and not just me and some people on forums misreading from the ambiguity of the book what people were going for. That reads me as an artifact of Concept A before it got changed.
Okay, I think that about wraps it up for the errata for the Solar Lore episode, so I do hope that's made some things clearer despite our ramblings. Thank you, and we'll catch you on whatever episode is lined up for you next. Thank you.
And cut.
The inevitable Theological Fight Club episode will come.
Oh, yes!